Fitness is one thing, survival is entirely another. Hey, welcome back. Today let's talk about what happened to two brothers who stepped onto K2 entirely blind to the reality of high altitude mountaineering. Brushing off every piece of expert advice thrown their way. They thought it was just another workout. The mountain proved otherwise, exposing a devastating error in a place where mistakes are fatal. On August 21st, 2019, the brothers were climbing above Camp 3 on K2 in Pakistan's Karakoram Range. Camp 3 sat at roughly 23,300 feet, while the section they were climbing was several hundred feet higher, at approximately 24,000 feet above sea level. They were following the normal route toward the bottleneck, one of the steepest parts of the mountain. The slope ahead was covered with hard snow and blue ice, and nearly every climber on the route was connected to the same fixed rope. The weather had finally settled after days of strong wind. Visibility was clear, temperatures stayed well below freezing, and several expeditions chose the same day to move higher because nobody knew how long the conditions would last. Even though the air felt cold, the ice along parts of the route had already spent weeks going through the same cycle of bright daytime sun followed by freezing nights. That's one thing I've learned from researching K2. The mountain can look exactly the same every morning, even though the ice underneath is slowly changing from one day to the next. This stretch above Camp 3 wasn't considered the hardest climbing on K2. The route was already marked with fixed ropes installed earlier that season, so climbers simply clipped in with a mechanical ascender, climbed a few feet, then repeated the same process again and again. If you've watched my K2 stories before, this routine will probably sound familiar. By the time climbers reach this altitude, they've already clipped into fixed ropes hundreds of times. It becomes almost automatic, which is exactly why everyone depends on the system working the way it's supposed to. The two brothers had spent most of their adult lives around fitness. Callum Reyes was 38. His younger brother, Evan, was 34. Together they owned a small chain of gyms in Fresno. Callum handled most of the business operations, while Evan coached clients and managed the training floor. Friends described them as competitive with each other, but unusually close. And over the years, they had completed nearly every major climbing trip together. Outside the gym, they were always looking for a bigger challenge. They climbed Mount Rainier, then Aconcagua, and later completed Denali's West Buttress. Every successful expedition reinforced the same belief. If they trained harder than everyone else, stayed disciplined, and refused to quit, they could handle almost anything a mountain demanded. According to their friends, they definitely respected the mountain, but they carried this unshakable belief that their own preparation, fitness, and sheer mental grit were enough to conquer anything. They treated K2 like a problem to be solved with enough discipline. But K2 doesn't care about your training. You can be the strongest person on the planet and it still doesn't change the reality of unstable snow, unpredictable weather, or frayed rope installed by a stranger weeks ago that you're forced to trust with your life. That difference wouldn't seem important when they first reached base camp. It would become much more important later. One thing the brothers quickly noticed was that K2 didn't operate like the mountains they had climbed before. On Rainier, or Denali, most of the equipment they depended on had either been placed by their own team or checked as they climbed. K2 was different. Above base camp, almost every expedition shared the same route, the same fixed ropes, and many of the same anchors. Once those ropes were installed early in the season, team after team relied on them for weeks. I think that's one of the easiest things to overlook if you've never climbed a mountain like K2. You're trusting equipment that someone else installed days or even weeks earlier, often without knowing who placed it or when it was last checked. The brothers joined a mid-sized commercial expedition based in Skardu. Their lead high-altitude worker was Iqbal Shigri, who had spent more than a decade working on K2. He was one of the expedition's most experienced Balti high-altitude workers, having spent more than a decade guiding climbers on K2 and helping establish the shared fixed ropes each season. Before the summit push, Shigri gathered the team for one last briefing inside the dining tent at base camp. Most of it covered things the brothers had already heard during the previous weeks. Stay clipped into the fixed rope, keep enough distance from the climber ahead, monitor the supplemental oxygen systems assigned to members of their expedition, and don't rush through anchor transfers. But Shigri also spent time talking about the mountain itself. Shigri spent extra time talking about the fixed ropes and anchors. He reminded everyone that the route wasn't permanent just because it had already been climbed. Ice screws that felt solid 1 week could become unreliable after repeated freezing nights and sunny afternoons. If anyone reported movement in an anchor, He said, "Nobody should assume it would still be safe the next day." That's the kind of advice that's easy to hear without really understanding why it matters. Nothing about an ice screw tells you how secure it is just by looking at it. Most of the time, if something is wrong, you don't find out until weight is put on it. The brothers listened, but afterward they mostly talked about the climb itself. Throughout the expedition, Callum and Evan kept returning to the same conclusion. If they stayed strong enough to keep climbing, everything else would take care of itself. When other climbers talked about changing ice conditions or old anchors, the brothers treated those as normal mountain problems that experienced guides would handle. For them, the biggest challenge was still the altitude. They had spent months increasing their endurance, training with heavy packs, and sleeping in altitude tents at home to prepare for thinner air. Between them, they probably spent more time talking about heart rate, oxygen, saturation, and pacing than about fixed anchors or ice conditions. That wasn't unusual. Many first-time K2 climbers focus on getting their own bodies ready because that's the part they can actually control. The mountain, though, has its own variables. By the middle of August, climbers from several expeditions had already mentioned that a few ice screws above Camp 3 felt looser than expected. Nobody considered it an emergency. Loose anchors are reported on K2 almost every season, especially after weeks of freezing nights and sunny afternoons. Normally, high-altitude workers replace or reinforce them as they move through the route. This time, however, there wasn't one expedition responsible for every anchor. Each team assumed the sections they weren't actively using would likely be handled by someone else. Looking back, that's where this story really begins. Not with a dramatic mistake, but with a maintenance issue that didn't seem urgent enough for any one team to stop and fix immediately. By the third week of August, everyone at base camp was paying close attention to the weather forecast. K2 rarely gives climbers more than a few good summit days each season, and forecasters expected August 22nd and 23rd to offer the best conditions before stronger winds returned. Because of that forecast, several expeditions adjusted their schedules at nearly the same time. More climbers began moving toward Camp 3, and everyone planned to use the same fixed ropes during the summit push. One thing I've noticed while researching K2 is that the mountain gets much busier when a weather window finally opens. There aren't many alternate routes, so most teams end up climbing through the same sections within hours of each other. Callum and Evan spent the afternoon getting their equipment ready. Because their commercial expedition planned to use supplemental oxygen on the upper mountain, they inspected their regulators and checked the pressure in each cylinder. They also replaced the batteries in their headlamps, inspected their crampons, and made sure their ascenders moved smoothly along the fixed rope. After several weeks on the mountain, those checks had become part of their normal routine. The climb from Camp 2 to Camp 3 went as expected. Late that afternoon, one climber from another expedition reached one of the fixed anchors above camp. As she shifted her weight onto the rope, she felt the ice screw move slightly. It did not pull out, and it continued to support her weight, but it should not have moved at all. During the expedition's review, she later compared it to a bolt that still holds but turns slightly when pressure is applied. After reaching Camp 3, a climber reported what she had noticed. To Shigri, what she had noticed. Shigri passed the information to the other high-altitude workers, and everyone agreed the anchor should be checked before the summit teams moved through that section. That detail really stood out to me because the warning wasn't ignored. The information reached the people responsible for working on the route, and everyone understood that the anchor needed attention. The difficulty was deciding when to do it. By the time the team reached Camp 3, the day was already coming to an end. Going back to replace the anchor would have required climbing onto steep terrain again, carrying additional equipment, and spending more time above camp before the summit push even started. Since the anchor was still holding, the workers planned to inspect and reinforce it while moving higher the next morning. That decision was consistent with how many routine maintenance jobs are handled on K2. Loose anchors are reported almost every season, and most are replaced before they become a serious problem. Callum and Evan finished dinner, checked their oxygen bottles one more time, and prepared for a short night's rest before leaving camp around midnight. They had spent years preparing for this expedition, and everything still seemed to be going according to plan. Their training had gone well, the weather forecast remained favorable, and the route ahead looked no different from the day before. What nobody could see was whether the ice around that anchor had changed any further. From the outside, it still looked secure, and there was nothing about its appearance that would have caused a climber passing by to stop and question it. The team woke shortly after midnight on August 21st. At that altitude, almost nobody wakes up feeling completely rested. Callum had a mild headache, and Evans said he felt slower than usual while putting on his climbing gear. Neither symptom surprised the guides. Above 23,000 feet, headaches, poor sleep, and fatigue are common, even among climbers who are acclimatizing normally. The expedition physician had already checked the team before they left Camp 3. No one showed signs that would have justified ending the climb. Not every climber on K2 uses bottled oxygen, and many ascents have been completed without it. Callum and Evans' commercial expedition, however, had chosen to use supplemental oxygen during the summit push. Both brothers were running their systems at about 2 liters per minute, which was the normal flow rate under their expedition's oxygen plan. By a little after 7 that morning, the sun had reached much of the upper route. The air temperature remained well below freezing, but several sections of the climbing line had already been exposed to hours of direct sunlight. That wasn't unusual. Ice on K2 goes through that cycle almost every day during the climbing season. I've found that this is one of the biggest differences between how people imagine ice and how it actually behaves. Most of us think of ice as something that stays the same until it melts. On a mountain like K2, it is constantly changing. Those changes are usually small, but they matter because every anchor depends on the ice around it remaining strong enough to hold. The summit teams climbed steadily above Camp 3. Shigri led the group, moving at the pace experienced high-altitude workers usually maintain. Behind him came Callum. Evan climbed farther back with another experienced high-altitude worker. The spacing between climbers was intentional. Guides try to avoid having several people. Keeping some distance also reduces the chance that one climber will interfere with another while transferring between rope sections. By late morning, the group reached the same anchor the climber had reported the previous afternoon. From the outside, nothing looked different. The ice screw was still in place, and the rope remained attached. There were no visible cracks in the surrounding ice, and no one approaching the anchor had any obvious reason to stop. At around 11:40 that morning, Callum reached the anchor first. He followed the same routine he had used throughout the expedition. He unclipped his ascender from the lower section of rope, shifted his weight onto the anchor while reaching for the next section, and prepared to continue climbing. This might sound like a small amount, but every climber on K2 repeats it hundreds of times during an expedition. It becomes one of the most routine movements on the mountain. Investigators later found nothing to suggest that Callum rushed, skipped a step, or handled his equipment incorrectly. What had changed wasn't Callum's technique, it was the ice holding the anchor. Investigators later concluded that repeated freeze-thaw cycles had likely weakened the ice around the screw over the previous several weeks. The anchor itself showed no mechanical defect after it was recovered. The problem was that the surrounding ice could no longer hold the load placed on it. The moment Callum shifted his full weight onto the rope, the entire ice screw pulled free. It happened so quickly that none of the climbers nearby had time to react. The fixed rope suddenly lost its support at that anchor, and Callum lost his balance on the steep slope. He fell backward and immediately began sliding down the hard snow and blue ice before anyone could reach him. The anchor failed so quickly that none of the climbers had time to grab the rope before Callum started sliding. On terrain that steep, losing your footing usually happens in less than a second. Once the ice screw pulled free, the fixed rope above him went slack, and there was nothing left to support his weight. Callum slid backward for about 25 to 30 feet before the fall came to a sudden stop. Investigators later determined that the rope above him did not stop the fall. Instead, the lower ascender that was still attached to the fixed rope below the failed anchor caught his weight. During every anchor transfer, climbers briefly remained connected to both sections of rope before removing the lower attachment. Callum had not yet unclipped that lower ascender, so it became the only remaining connection keeping him on the mountain. That detail really stood out to me because it shows how small routine habits can matter. Callum wasn't improvising, he was following the procedure exactly as he had been taught. If he had disconnected from the lower rope a few seconds earlier, investigators believed he likely would have fallen much farther. The force of the fall created another problem. About 40 feet below the failed anchor, the fixed rope crossed a narrow rock rib that cut across the climbing route. Under normal conditions, climbers stepped over that section without giving it much thought. During the fall, however, the rope was pulled tightly against the exposed rock. When investigators later examined the rope, they found heavy abrasion on the outer sheath where it had scraped across the stone. The rope remained intact, but the damage showed how close the system had come to suffering a second failure. Evan watched the fall from farther down the route. He immediately climbed back toward his brother as soon as another experienced high-altitude worker instructed on steep terrain like this. Everyone cannot rush toward the injured person at once because too many people on the same section of rope create additional hazards. By the time he reached Callum, he had already checked that the remaining anchors were holding and confirmed that Callum was still attached to the rope. Callum was awake and answered questions clearly, but he immediately complained of severe pain in his right leg and lower back. His lower leg was bent below the knee in a way that strongly suggested a fracture. His breathing was rapid, and the skin around his oxygen mask appeared pale from the cold and the physical stress of the fall. Shigri reached them a few minutes later and completed a second assessment. He checked Callum's helmet for damage, confirmed that his oxygen system was still working, and examined him for any obvious head injury. Although Callum remained alert, he could not stand or place any weight on his right leg. Evan stayed beside his brother while the assessment continued. He adjusted Callum's oxygen mask when it shifted during the examination, handed equipment to the rescuers, and helped keep him steady on the narrow slope while Shigri secured the area. I think that's a part people sometimes completely overlook in mountain rescues. Family members usually cannot perform the technical rescue, but honestly, they often become another vital set of hands. On K2, where there are no professional rescue crews waiting above base camp, it just makes sense that everyone nearby ends up helping however they can. The climbers quickly realized that the fall itself was no longer the biggest problem. Callum could not walk, and they were stranded at roughly 24,000 feet above sea level. Camp 3 was several hundred vertical feet below them, but reaching it with an injured climber would still take hours. Every additional hour spent at that altitude reduced the options available to everyone involved in the rescue. They knew the priority was to call for help, but even that took time. Radios do not work reliably everywhere on K2 because steep ridges and uneven terrain can block the signal. When Shigri could not establish a clear connection from the accident site, he instructed another Balti high-altitude worker, Rahim Ali, to descend along the fixed line. Rahim climbed about 300 feet lower before reaching a section of the route with a clear radio connection to Camp 3. At around 12:05 p.m., about 25 minutes after the fall, Camp 3 received the first report. The message was relayed to Base Camp, where it was broadcast over the shared radio frequency used by several expeditions that season. Now, one thing I've learned from researching K2 is that there isn't a rescue team waiting for calls like this. When someone is seriously injured high on the mountain, the climbers already there become the rescue team. A helicopter was never considered a realistic option. In 2019, Pakistani military helicopters could generally reach base camp and, under favorable conditions, sometimes higher sections of the lower mountain. Callum was injured at roughly 24,000 feet, far beyond the altitude where a helicopter could safely hover or conduct a rescue. Everyone on the mountain understood that getting him down would depend entirely on the people already climbing with him. Shigri and another climber worked on stabilizing Callum's injuries. They used a trekking pole, webbing, and extra clothing to make a temporary splint for his broken leg because carrying a full medical splint that high on K2 was not practical. Shigri also checked the regulator and hose connected to Callum's oxygen system to make sure neither had been damaged during the fall. Evan stayed beside his brother throughout the process. He helped secure the splint, monitored the pressure in Callum's oxygen cylinder, and passed equipment to the rescuers as they asked for it. About half an hour after the first radio call, the first high-altitude workers from another expedition reached the scene. A second team soon abandoned its own summit attempt and sent more workers to help. That decision says a lot about the people who climb K2. A summit opportunity may come only once in an entire season, yet several climbers immediately gave up that chance because someone else needed help. By about 1:45 that afternoon, 7 experienced high-altitude workers had gathered at the accident site. They began lowering Callum from one anchor to the next, using the fixed ropes below the failed section. Before anyone trusted an anchor, one of the workers tested it by hand. After watching one anchor fail, nobody wanted to assume the next one was secure without checking it first. The descent moved much more slowly than anyone hoped. The rescue team later estimated they were lowering Callum only about 150 vertical feet each hour. That sounds painfully slow until you consider what they were doing. Every few yards, they had to stop, secure Callum to the next anchor, transfer the ropes one connection at a time, test each anchor before trusting it, reposition the rescuers, and carefully lower him again. A healthy climber could descend the same section much faster, but evacuating someone who could not stand turned every anchor into a separate technical rescue. Evan remained with the rescue for the entire descent. More than once, Shigri urged Evan to descend with another group while the experienced rescuers handled the evacuation. Evan refused every time. He insisted on staying beside his brother and continued helping carry oxygen cylinders, steady the ropes, and assist wherever another pair of hands was needed. As the afternoon continued, the rescue became physically demanding for everyone on the mountain. Each lowering sequence often took several minutes before anyone could move again. While one rescuer controlled the rope, others secured Callum, clipped into the next section of fixed line, checked the next anchor, and made sure nobody loaded the system too early. During those pauses, everyone remained standing on steep ice, while supporting their own weight and waiting for the next controlled descent. By late afternoon, some of the rescuers noticed that Evan had become quieter than he had been earlier in the day. He answered questions more slowly and needed reminders to drink water and check the remaining pressure in his oxygen system. No one considered that unusual. He had spent the entire day helping rescue his injured brother after climbing above 23,000 feet, and everyone assumed fatigue and emotional stress were beginning to catch up with him. Looking back, that assumption would become much more important than anyone realized at the time. After nearly 7 hours on the mountain, the rescue team reached Camp 3 shortly after 7 o'clock that evening. They had lowered Callum only about 700 to 900 vertical feet from where he fell. On most mountains, that distance would not take long to descend, but on K2, every section had required another carefully controlled lowering over steep terrain, making the rescue far slower than a normal descent. The expedition physician examined Callum as soon as he arrived. His broken leg was obvious, but his vital signs were more concerning. His blood pressure had dropped, his pulse remained elevated, and his oxygen levels stayed critically low despite supplemental oxygen. He also reported increasing pain in his chest and pelvis, suggesting internal injuries that could not be treated on the mountain. The physician determined that continuing the descent that night would place both Callum and the rescue team at greater risk. So, the decision was made to keep him at Camp 3 until first light. Evan remained with his brother throughout the night. He monitored Callum's oxygen equipment, replaced empty cylinders, and assisted the medical team when needed. Around 4:15 the next morning, Callum's condition deteriorated rapidly. He became difficult to wake, his breathing slowed, and his heart stopped despite continued oxygen therapy and resuscitation attempts. And with only limited medical equipment available at Camp 3, more than 23,000 feet above sea level, there was little more the team could do. Callum Reyes was pronounced dead at Camp 3 on August 22nd. 2019. As preparations began to move his body down the mountain later that morning, several rescuers noticed that Evan was unsteady on his feet. At first, they believed he was simply exhausted after spending nearly a full day at extreme altitude helping with the rescue. He had spent almost 24 hours above 23,000 feet, slept very little, carried equipment during the rescue, and had just lost his older brother. When he paused before clipping into the fixed rope, everyone assumed exhaustion and grief were affecting his concentration. A short time later, while descending toward Camp 2, the symptoms became harder to ignore. Evan stumbled several times on terrain he normally would have crossed without difficulty. He answered simple questions slowly, struggled to follow routine instructions, and twice reached for the wrong carabiner before another climber corrected him. Shigri immediately stopped the descent. The doctor, who was traveling lower on the route with another group, climbed back up to examine him. After a brief assessment, he concluded that Evan was showing signs consistent with high-altitude cerebral edema, commonly called HACE, a life-threatening condition in which prolonged exposure to extreme altitude causes swelling of the brain. The rescue team immediately changed priorities. They administered dexamethasone, raised the flow rate on Evan's supplemental oxygen system, and began moving him downhill as quickly as the terrain would safely allow. Unlike the previous day's rescue, there was no discussion about waiting. Everyone knew that rapid descent offered the only realistic chance of survival. For a short time, Evan appeared to improve. Then, less than an hour into the descent, he became increasingly confused and eventually lost consciousness. The rescuers continued lowering him toward Camp 2 while maintaining oxygen and monitoring his breathing, but his condition continued to deteriorate. By the time they reached the lower camp, the expedition physician determined that the swelling had progressed beyond what could be managed on the mountain. Despite continuous treatment and ongoing evacuation efforts, Evan Reyes died later that afternoon before he could be transported to base camp. In less than 24 hours, K2 had claimed both brothers. One died from injuries caused by a failed anchor. The other died after remaining at extreme altitude long enough to help bring his brother home. Poor weather delayed any immediate recovery effort. Low clouds moved over the upper mountain during the afternoon, and fresh snowfall increased the avalanche danger below Camp 3. Rather than risk additional lives, expedition leaders agreed to leave both brothers at the camp until conditions improved. The weather cleared enough on August 25th for a recovery team to begin moving them down the mountain. High-altitude workers from several expeditions volunteered to help. Using the same fixed rope system that had been involved in the accident, they carefully lowered both brothers through the steep sections above Camp 2 before continuing toward base camp. Pakistani authorities later completed the formal recovery process, and military helicopters transported the bodies from base camp to Skardu. With the rescue complete, attention turned to understanding exactly what had happened. Unlike aviation or industrial accidents, fatal mountaineering incidents on K2 are not investigated by a permanent independent agency. Instead, expedition operators, liaison officers, guides, and climbing organizations work together to review witness accounts, photographs, radio logs, equipment, and the condition of the route. Investigators interviewed everyone who had been present during the accident, and one of the most important pieces of evidence was the failed anchor itself. After the season ended, the ice screw was recovered and examined. Investigators found no evidence that the ice screw had failed mechanically. It was properly installed and showed no manufacturing defects. Instead, they concluded that repeated cycles of daytime melting and nighttime refreezing had gradually weakened the surrounding ice. That finding really changed how I looked at this case. The equipment worked as designed. The mountain had changed around it. The investigation also confirmed that movement in the anchor had been reported the day before the accident and was expected to be inspected before the summit push. That inspection never happened. Investigators found no evidence that anyone deliberately ignored the warning. Instead, responsibility had become unclear because multiple expeditions shared the fixed ropes, leaving no single team responsible for replacing the anchor. The review also concluded that the younger brother died from high-altitude cerebral edema, caused by prolonged exposure to extreme altitude during the rescue. Although treatment and descent began as soon as his symptoms became obvious, investigators determined the illness had likely been developing for several hours before it was recognized. Investigators found no evidence that either brother violated climbing procedures. However, they noted that Evan remained at extreme altitude throughout the rescue despite repeated opportunities to descend, significantly increasing his exposure to the conditions that later caused high-altitude cerebral edema. In the months that followed, several expedition operators discussed improving how shared fixed ropes were managed on K2. While no single international standard was adopted, more teams began emphasizing documented inspections of anchors after significant weather changes, instead of assuming previously installed protection remained reliable throughout the climbing season. I think that's what makes this case so difficult to forget. The Reyes brothers came to K2 believing it was mostly a test of strength. The investigation found something different. The ice had changed beneath them. On K2, even doing everything right cannot always overcome a mountain that's constantly changing.